25 men were arrested and taken to the prison. They were pulled for interrogations, beatings, and torture, execution without a known place of burial.
I am pleased to introduce you to Aileen Friesen, who is currently a professor of history at the University of Winnipeg and also executive director of the Plett Foundation. Aileen grew up listening to stories about Russia from her maternal grandparents who left the Soviet Union in the 1920s. To understand their homeland, she pursued a master's degree in Russian studies, learned the language, and eventually completed a PhD in Russian history. Over the years, she has traveled extensively in Ukraine and Russia, conducting research in Zaporizhia, Omsk, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. For 3 weeks, she lived in the village of Apollonovska, formerly Waldheim, in the Omsk province, interviewing local Baptist Mennonite farmers. She has published a variety of articles related to the history of Mennonites in the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. As well, she has published the book Colonizing Russia's Promised Land, Orthodoxy and Community on the Siberian Steppe, with University of Toronto Press, and the Russian Mennonite Story by Paul Taves with Aileen Friesen. Together, let's learn what Aileen has prepared for us tonight.
In this presentation, Secrets from the Ukrainian KGB Archives, I will explore how the accessibility of these archival files has not only offered the prospect of closure to Mennonite families, but has also provided new insights into Mennonite life under the Stalinist regime. These remarks are based on research conducted through the KGB Archival Project at the University of Winnipeg, which was started in 2018 and has 3 primary goals: to provide information to families about the fate of their loved ones, to preserve this history through the collection of documents and stories, and finally to promote scholarly research on this period. This project is coordinated through the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg. Seed money has been provided by the Paul Taves Professorship Fund, which supports research on the history of Mennonites in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. This fund was started in 2017 by Dr. Royden Lowen and the Mennonite Heritage Cruise Group, led by Marina and the late Walter Unger, in honor of the late Dr. Paul Taves, a historian who dedicated much of his life to preserving this history for future generations. With help from Dr. Maria Malentova, I've been investigating the experiences of Mennonites arrested by the Soviet security apparatus during the 1930s and early 1940s, located in the Zaporizhia State Archives. It is important to note that this is not a Mennonite story. Within the Soviet Union, people from all backgrounds were targeted by the security apparatus of the state. I also want to add that during this period of repression, Mennonites were not arrested because they were Mennonite. However, their nationality, German, their social or class status as ascribed by state officials, and their religious identity could all be used against them during these arrests. It is worth noting that I am being quite loose with the term Mennonite in this presentation. A Mennonite is someone who has a traditional Mennonite last name and is identified in the files as being of German nationality. This is not necessarily accurate, although it is also not necessarily inaccurate. While the traditional pillars of the Mennonite community and Mennonite communal identity lasted well into the 1920s, the 1930s eroded these pillars in significant ways. Finally, all of the specific cases I mention in this presentation are of people who have been rehabilitated. In Soviet terminology, this means they have been exonerated, their convictions overturned, and their rights fully restored. In some cases, this process is covered extensively in the archival files, which will be a part of my presentation. It is perhaps useful to divide these experiences into the following periods to capture some general trends that I've seen so far and to give some basic understanding of what can be found in these files and what cannot. My description should be considered preliminary, as further investigation is necessary for me to draw more concrete conclusions. The first period is 1929 to 1930. In the region of Zaporizhia, this includes approximately 60 files. I haven't personally looked at any of these files, but other records indicate that the accusations included anti-Soviet agitation, conducting anti-Soviet propaganda, and trying to emigrate from the Soviet Union. In most cases, these people were deported north. The next period is 1933 to 35. There are approximately 70 cases in this category. These are some of the most interesting files, as you can find the authentic voice of the accused within them. Since most of these people were sent to the Gulag, we can also find other sources to confirm themes found within the interrogation files. The third group covers the years 1937 to 38. This is the bulk of the cases found in the archives. As the rest of the presentation will address these files, I won't offer any further comments at this moment. I have to admit that the next two categories I didn't expect to find when I started this project. We can find a set of files related to the summer and fall of 1941. Even after Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, the NKVD still continued its work, arresting both Mennonite men and women for anti-Soviet agitation and for being socially dangerous elements. These cases should be distinguished from the mass deportations of Mennonites, which took place without the production of an NKVD file. 1944 to 1946, we can find files of the prosecution of people, mainly women, who registered as Volksdeutsche during the occupation of Ukraine by German forces. The NKVD prosecuted Mennonite and Ukrainian women who were married to Mennonite men, who were captured outside the Soviet Union after they had been relocated with the retreating German army in 1943. These files provide some information about their movements between 1943 to their arrests. It also gives glimpses into why people registered as Volksdeutsche. In the case of Maria Heinrichs, a Ukrainian woman married to a Mennonite man, she registered to receive rations to help feed her children. She was sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp. This was a typical sentence received by women in these files. I will focus on files created from 1937 to 1938, as the bulk of the inquiries we've answered have been related to this period. During this time, known as the Great Terror, NKVD agents laid siege to both urban and rural spaces, arresting approximately 1.5 million people. These people were either sent to the Gulag or were shot. Mennonites and their neighbors, caught in this maelstrom, had few options when the NKVD trucks pulled into their village or town. In Niederhortitza, for instance, on October 10, 1938, 25 men, many of whom were ordinary workers on the local collective farm, were arrested and taken to the prison in Zaporizhia. After being sentenced to death by an NKVD extrajudicial committee known as a troika, the majority of these men were executed on November 13, 1938. While this story includes 25 Mennonites, I have found a number of cases in which Germans, with Mennonite last names, Ukrainians, and Jews, and just to be clear, all three of those categories are in reference to nationalities identified within a person's passport, went through the system together. On June 15, 1938, the NKVD in Zaporizhia separately arrested and jailed Aaron Siemens, a German, and Isaac Ginsberg, a Jew. Ginsberg was charged with being an agent of German intelligence, while Siemens was charged with being a member of a counter-revolutionary organization. On September 29, 1938, both men were sentenced to death by an NKVD extrajudicial committee, a troika. Even though the fate of most people taken into the system was determined from the outset, it is worth pausing to imagine this troika, 3 men in a room, surrounded by stacks of files, signing off on the execution of hundreds of people a day. In this case, Siemens and Ginsberg were executed, presumably at the same place, on October 21, 1938. Some files found in the archives address the arrest and prosecution of one individual, such as the case of Anna Ham, shown in the photograph. The NKVD arrested Ham, a mother of 2, at the beginning of September 1937 for systematically campaigning against Soviet authorities. Ham was living in Zaporizhia at the time of her arrest, having been born across the river in Hortitsa. Other files contain a long list of names and can span over 500 pages. NKVD operatives claim to have discovered a German counter-revolutionary spy network in Hortitsa. On December 14, 1937, the NKVD arrested 14 men between the ages of 27 and 61. Included on the list was an electrician, a medical technician, a collective farm worker, an accountant, and a carpenter, all taken to the Zaporizhzhia prison for interrogation. I will use these two cases, Anna Ham and the alleged Hortitsa spy network, to walk you through these files. For the victims, the process typically started with a search of their home after the dreaded knock of the NKVD agents. The agents then, in the words of one victim, rummaged ruthlessly through the house. In the archival files, a version of such moments is preserved through the document search record, which itemized the objects confiscated from the property. These search records offer a brief glimpse into what aspects of material culture NKVD agents considered damning. In addition to taking the person's passport, the case files show that they also confiscated items such as personal letters and, in one case, a handwritten book of German songs. Anna Ham's long search record included 2 silver American dollars and a silver teaspoon. You can see her form on the left. For the alleged Hortitsa spy network, the search records were not preserved, but each man had an arrest form in the file, which provided their basic information, including where they worked, their party affiliation, and their family status. You can see Peter Clausen's arrest form, which shows that he was an electrician for the factory named Karl Marx. He was not a member of the Communist Party, and he was married, a father to 2 young boys, ages 6 and 1. When both parents were arrested, which happened in the case of Anna Ham, the NKVD sent underage children to an orphanage. This document provides information on Anna's family. Her son Christian, 21 years old, was left alone, but her 11-year-old daughter, Margarita, ended up in an orphanage. Sometimes relatives would claim the child, but not always. To be associated with people considered enemies by the state could have repercussions. Memoirs speak to this apprehension as well as the guilt on the part of people who felt they could not help these young family members. During this period, the accusations against Mennonites and others escalated as the Soviet regime intensified its struggle against imaginary enemies living within its borders. The accusations, as NKVD officials piled on the adjectives to emphasize the nefariousness of the activities, would be almost comical if they didn't have such grave consequences. For example, the men arrested in the alleged spy network based in Hortitsa were charged with being members of a counter-revolutionary fascist German sabotage organization. Although the NKVD arrested mostly men, a number of women were also targeted, as the example of Anna Ham attests. While many were charged with carrying out counter-revolutionary activities with their husbands, some were charged with crimes specific to them. For example, Margarita Fast, who was a nurse in Zaporizhzhia, was charged with systematically campaigning against the Soviet system. She was sentenced to death and executed on January 14, 1938. Those arrested by the NKVD ended up in prisons, often held in a room with hundreds of others. They were pulled from this holding cell for interrogations, which according to memoirs often included beatings and torture. The archival files I've been researching include handwritten transcripts of these interrogations. Many families hope that these transcripts will provide some clues or insights into the experiences of their loved ones. Unfortunately, files related to the Great Terror often offer little information about individuals. They tell us much more about the procedure followed by NKVD agents, the corners they cut, for instance plagiarizing text, practically just inserting a name into a litany of bogus claims, and the categories they use to condemn people. The phraseology of the interrogation answers often confirm that the words written on these pages were never spoken by the accused. Instead, as Lynn Viola has shown in her research on Stalinist perpetrators, NKVD agents, under pressure to move people through the system, often invented stories and then tortured people until they agreed to sign. And these files don't reveal what the individual experienced. For instance, during his interrogation, Abram Gunther, who was arrested as part of the Hortitsa spy ring, allegedly named many co-conspirators belonging to this fascist counter-revolutionary organization. What does this tell us? It tells us that he signed his name, but we can't make assumptions about what he said, what he experienced, and what he felt. Interpreting these documents as revealing something about the character of those arrested is problematic. This doesn't mean that these files offer nothing to families. Many have commented that the signature of the victim at the bottom of each interrogation page offers a connection to this lost past. There are exceptions to this general rule, however, which also raises questions about the treatment of men and women within the system. Anna Ham, for instance, refused her interrogator's narrative of her actions. I will loosely quote from her interrogation. Interrogator: You are accused of carrying out counter-revolutionary activities with your husband among workers and clerks at the Communard factory. I demand a confession from you. Ham: I did not carry out counter-revolutionary work among workers and clerks with my husband. Interrogator: You are not telling the truth. You and your husband carried out counter-revolutionary activities at the Communard factory among workers and clerks. I demand the truth from you. Ham: I repeat again, I did not carry out counter-revolutionary activities with my husband. I am answering truthfully. In the end, Anna's protest did not save her. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison as the wife of an enemy of the people. As the example of Abram Gunther alludes to, the NKVD often relied on the naming of alleged co-conspirators in their interrogations to help them wrap up their cases. As many scholars have noted, words often offered the only evidence for conviction. Little to no other evidence was offered by the state to support these accusations. There were no leaflets from these alleged counter-revolutionary organizations, no membership lists. Typically, there was no physical material to link these people to the crimes that the state alleged that they had committed. This is not surprising, as NKVD agents fabricated these organizations, but it underlines why testimony from alleged conspirators and evidence offered by witnesses were so important to collect. The issue of witness statements and denunciations has an interesting history in the collective memories of people who survived this period. Many memoirs and family stories mention betrayals from within the community, sometimes even naming names. Once again, we need to be careful how we interpret these documents. Even people who provided statements to the NKVD often did so because of threats made against themselves and their families. In these files, I've also found cases of people giving evidence against other family members. Like I said, the documents give us no information about the pressure tactics deployed by the NKVD agents. The people represented in these files are not simply individuals. They were someone's parent, grandparent, or child. Their arrest and subsequent disappearance tore apart families and sent ripples through the community. As the process was secretive, families were not informed about the fate of their loved one. After the death of Stalin, families started to write to the Soviet security apparatus. The archival files are filled with these letters from within the Soviet Union and from abroad, asking what happened to their loved one. There's one example, which is displayed in the photograph, that I use regularly because it captures both the pain and resilience of these families. Agnes Dick wrote every year to the Soviet state from Issyk-Kul in Omsk province asking about her father, Jacob Dick, who was taken from Khortytsa. Her first letter, sent in 1957, stated it had been 18 years and she still didn't know what had happened to her father. The following year, she wrote again, "It has been 19 years. Do you have any information so I can know whether my father lives or not?" The next year, she wrote again, "It has been 20 years. Despite holding out little hope that he was alive, Agnes kept writing. In some cases, the KGB reopened the case. We shouldn't interpret this as a sign that this institution was committed to justice. Once again, procedure is essential for understanding these files. Agents went through the procedure. They went through the motions of reinvestigating these cases. For the alleged Khortytsa spy ring, the assistant public prosecutor revisited the case starting at the end of 1957. Interestingly enough, officials reconsidering the case commented that the absence of Soviet Germans in Khortytsa after the Second World War meant it was difficult to find people to question. They ended up finding 4 people of other nationalities living in Khortytsa and asked them about the 14 accused. Question: Do you know? And then he gives the list of the 14 names. What can you tell us about their anti-Soviet counter-revolutionary activities? Answer. Of them, I know Martins and Wilms. I do not know anything about counter-revolutionary activities, and I did not notice anything bad about them. I remember that Martins worked as a stoker in my workshop. He was an elderly man at the time. He worked conscientiously. I can't say anything about Wilms. And by the time the 4 witnesses had been interrogated, miraculously all of the accused men had been accounted for. It had been confirmed that they did not belong to a counter-revolutionary organization. And then to wrap it up, the file indicates that the former head of the 3rd Department of the NKVD in Dnipropetrovsk, Yosef Taksar, had been dismissed from the NKVD in 1939 because of his falsification of materials. On the 30th of July, 1958, the case was overturned because of a lack of evidence. Each of these files hints at the layers of suffering caused by these arrests. What they don't tell us is how this suffering reverberated across generations. I've never been able to tell anyone who has asked us for information that their loved one lived. For cases associated with 1937 to 38, the answer has always been execution. Execution without a known place of burial. The intimate nature of this suffering sometimes leads us to think of these files as a dead end, a bureaucratic summation of individual lives cut short. But these people were more than the files that I have described today. And these stories of individuals, of families, of communities, of resilience are worth remembering.
Verna's wondering, the documents are obviously in Russian. Have these been translated into English? If so, can they be accessed?
So right now they are in Russian, and sometimes I have someone transliterate them from handwritten Russian into Russian. Some individual families are having their own files translated, but that is not a service that we offer. Our main goal is collecting the files and collecting the stories.
What happened to the belongings of the detainees? Were these items seized and sold or simply stolen by the NKVD?
We have information that a lot of items never get returned to families, and so they probably end up at the local market being repurposed, shall we say, by NKVD officials, unfortunately. Yeah.
What does NKVD stand for?
So that's just the acronym for the security organization. And some people know it as the KGB, but that's what it becomes later on. And so these acronyms are just the stand-in for the security apparatus.
And Elena is wondering, what was the political motivation that led to such widespread judicial fraud?
The political motivation was that there were quotas that they were trying to fill that were coming from the center, and they had to give enough bodies, in essence. And so a certain number had to be sent to the gulag and another certain number had to be executed. And so that's one of the reasons why they're processing people so quickly. Sometimes you have people arrested and then executed within a month and a half of being taken.
And was there a need for workers in the gulag, or they just, for their own purposes, they needed to punish a certain number of people?
Yeah, the broader concept of the Great Terror is probably something that I can't summarize very quickly. There have been a lot of great books that describe Stalin's motivations for undertaking this. There are a number of different actions that are happening, including one that's targeting kulaks. So based on social status, there's a German operation, there's a Polish operation, so targeting specific nationalities. And on top of that, there is the targeting of specific people within the Communist Party as well, so a purge of the party. So there's all sorts of things happening during this time.
Ellen is saying, I would be interested in hearing about your grandparents' story.
So my grandparents are not a part of this. I am half 1870s and half 1920s. So we left before this took place, but of course we had relatives who stayed behind and experienced this. Although I should note that villages experienced it differently. So not every village would experience the same thing. Some villages were targeted and a lot of people were taken. Other villages were practically left alone.
And Werner is saying, is there in any indication in the files where the executed people are buried? You said that there's no
Normally, no, there's no indication, although there's indication of sort of which city it happened in. So there can be some, with in combination with local knowledge, probably we can figure something out. I'll just add to that. These documents are not pleasant to go through, and it's not a fun read for anyone to, even if it's not your own family. I mean, these are lives being destroyed on a paper before you, and it can be a very emotional experience, even for a researcher to look at these stories.
How do you deal with that as a researcher? Are there certain ways that you handle the horror of what you're reading?
We try to have nicer stories to do in combination with the more negative stories. So I have all sorts of research on the 1870s that I can go to as my happy place.
Nice. And John's wondering, are copies of all the files now housed in Winnipeg, and are they accessible online?
So no, we are just slowly collecting files, and these are not going to be, these files don't belong to us. Ukrainian archives, and so the idea that they'll be accessible online is probably not a reality of what will happen, but we hope to bring more files and investigate this story further.
And are you aware if Anna Ham did survive her sentence and eventually emigrated to Canada? Oh, she did. Catherine is saying she did. Her daughter is still living in Victoria. They are my great aunt and second cousin.
And this is why this outreach is, I think, so important, is that so that people can start offering their stories and the conclusion of these stories to us that we don't necessarily know. So I know Anna ended up in Kazakhstan, but then after that, I don't know. And so that would be wonderful if people can share these stories and try to collect them so that we can have more information for understanding this period.
And Maria is saying, are there pictures available of the prisoners, those who were executed, and are they accessible? Probably the answer to the accessibility again is no, but what about did a lot of photos of the prisoners get taken?
So in the files I've looked at, there have been very few photographs. From time to time there are, but there are very few. And I'm not entirely sure why this is, and I'll have to talk to the archivist about why this happened. Perhaps it's because some of these stories go so quickly. So between arrest and execution, there isn't a lot of time. And that's really an unfortunate part, because I know a lot of families would love to have a photograph.
Yeah. And has there been any access to archives in Russia?
No, so Ukraine has opened up their archives and allows researchers to go in, and so I can go in and look at files, and there are no issues. In Russia, you have to be related, and so you have to be able to prove that. And so this reduces the access for researchers. For immediate family, it is possible, but you have to communicate with the local archives.
Okay. And some people are wondering specifically about their families. Jake is wondering about his uncle Jacob Weens, who was shot in 1937. Is there any way for families to find out about their family members?
Yeah, so you can either write to me or write to our center and give the information, the name of your family member, first name, last name, and their father's first name, because that's the patronymic. Date of birth, if you have any information about where they were born, that's all useful information, and we can look for you. There's also ways to look for this on the internet, because the Ukrainians have done an excellent job of bringing this stuff together. But some of it is in Ukrainian. Some of it has been translated on Brent Weeb's website, but there are different searches too that individuals can take for basic information, and then files are just at the archives.
Julie's asking, did inability to account for firearms have anything to do with them being arrested?
No, possibly someone could use that as an excuse, but no, that's they had plenty of other things to arrest for, and it was normally, they didn't have a lack of excuses to find arrest. I think part of the people want to know is how you end up on one of these lists. And you can end up on one of these lists by the factory that you work at. So people are meeting and they put you down because they think that you belong to a kulak family, or you can end up on a list because of the village council where you are, and they need to provide names and they decide to provide your name. So you end up in lists for all sorts of reasons.
So it probably felt very random for people.
It felt very random for people. Yeah, for sure.
Wow. Do you have any information about those who were exiled in Karganda area and those from there who were sent to the gulags?
No, most of this research has been based in Ukraine. So there will be some people who are exiled to Kazakhstan, but this is not sort of people who are already there before the 1930s.
Okay. And Marlene is wondering, what was the Ukrainian-Russian archivist's perspective on these materials? Do they reveal any opinions about the actions of the NKVD in this era?
This is a sad story for everyone. Obviously, a lot of Ukrainians as well were targeted, and there are other groups, other ethnic groups whose families experienced this type of pain. So they are not. This is not a story of Ukrainians targeting Germans or anything like that.
Okay.
So they are aware, but they're also sensitive to the fact that life is complicated. So that this is a story of suffering for many people, but they kind of, don't want to necessarily dwell on it. They've had lots of experiences of hardship and suffering, and they just see this as one other aspect of that.
Right. And Wendell is wondering, how were people executed?
They were shot.
Okay. And John is wondering, given the current interest in Mennonite Nazi ties, did you find any use of the Nazi tag for anybody accused during these late 1930 dates?
Yeah, so they're using a lot of fascist. Fascist is being used an incredible amount of times, including in the early 1930s. These people are being labeled as fascist. Now, I want to just make clear that they were not fascist. They had absolutely no ties to fascism, but definitely the state is viewing them in that light, and that is a reflection of the deterioration of the relationship between the Soviet Union and Germany.
Right. Carlene is saying, I've heard that my great-grandfather was executed in 1937, but rehabilitated in 1957. Does that basically mean pardoned? Does rehabilitated mean pardoned?
Yeah, basically that means pardoned. Basically it means that they acknowledge that there actually wasn't enough evidence for the conviction, and they are restored with their rights. So it doesn't mean that they weren't executed at that time. They were. It's just they then say, okay, you are pardoned now.
Okay. Cindy's saying, in how many more regions of the Ukraine did this occur, specifically more in Western Ukraine?
No. So this is in, I have them divided out between where things are taking place at the time, but they're called rehabilitation books in different parts of Ukraine, and they have information about Mennonites and others who were targeted in these areas.
And so was it in particular areas in Ukraine or all around?
And all throughout Ukraine, there's going to be people who are targeted. Yeah.
Okay. Teresa has a question. She's wondering, were any Mennonites actually involved in anti-Soviet activities? So yes, they were accused of them, but is there any way to know if they were actually involved?
Well, so saying something bad about the Soviet state, if you're going to get shot for that, and I think that we're dealing with a pretty low bar. I'm sure that there were people who were unhappy with the way the Soviet state was functioning.
Right.
And perhaps they said something, but the idea that then they deserve to die for that is a little bit ludicrous. But for sure, the organizations that the NKVD claimed were operating were not operating.
Oh, okay. So there weren't counter-terrorism groups and
there weren't any counter-revolutionary groups. 100%, there were not any operating behind Soviet lines. No.
Okay. And Karen is wondering, did you say that Germans, Mennonites, and Jews were all targeted? Could you explain that again?
So Mennonites are Germans, just to be clear. By nationality, the Soviet Union considers them to be Germans. So I'm talking about Germans. The Mennonites are included there. And then there were people of Ukrainian background who were also targeted and executed. And there are people of Jewish background who are also targeted and executed. And for instance, I found one case in Hortica in which a young Jewish man was charged with being a member of a fascist organization, along with a Mennonite. So you can see that there are problems with the logic that is being deployed by the NKVD.
Right. Wow. And Robert comments that quite a few NKVD investigators were themselves later investigated and followed the paths of their victims. Do you have any data on that?
So I'm trying to follow the ones who are active in Zaporizhia. And I haven't had the chance to go back to the archives to start to look at their files, because their files would also be present in these archival collections. And so I can't really speak to that at this moment. But yes, a lot of agents were then targeted themselves and were made examples of and executed for fabricating records, which they were practically told to fabricate. So it's a complicated history.
Merle has a different kind of question. He's wondering, what was it like living in the village and interviewing people?
Oh, so that was in Siberia. That was on a much more pleasant topic of agriculture. I haven't interviewed anyone. Of course, those stories came up too. So people were targeted in the Omsk region. They were not any different from the Ukrainian region, and people were arrested. And so there was those hardship stories as well there, but we were focused mainly on agriculture. So it was not the same topic.
Nice. How many Mennonites were executed and how many were sent to the Gulag? Even approximate, do you have numbers around that? John is wondering.
I don't have approximate numbers, but just by scanning some of the rehabilitation books, a lot were executed.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't say for sure what the numbers are, but a lot were in that period of 1937 to 38. Obviously, in the early 30s is much different story. They get sent to the Gulag.
And Marjorie is wondering, why is the 1870s your happy place? What was so great happening in that time?
Oh, well, I'm looking at the migration in the 1870s that's taking place and just the dialogue between Mennonites. So I know this story has been looked at, but the Russian documents haven't been looked at for this 1870s story. And just the Russian documents of them, the Russian state trying to negotiate with the Mennonites very politely trying to counter offer the Russian state and trying to get a better deal. And then some people just saying, no, actually, we're gone. We've already sold our land and we're disappearing and we're going to Canada. It's a much different story than what you get in the Soviet Union.
Karen's wondering if you have a book you can recommend if people want to read about this. Have you written a book yet? She's asking.
I haven't written a book. I'm working on a book that is Faith Under Stalinism. So it deals with the famine and just the cultural warfare that Mennonites found themselves under with the Stalinist regime. Lynn Viola wrote a book called Stalinist Perpetrators, which is a good overview of kind of the state perspective of what's going on and their actions.
Right.
In terms of the Mennonites, there is really just the memoir literature out there of people sort of recalling this period. But this hasn't been sort of fully analyzed in scholarship. So hopefully that can happen. There is one article that looks at it by Peter Lepkeman. It's published in the Journal of Mennonite Studies, and I can't remember the exact date, but all the Journal of Mennonite Studies is online, and you can look that up. And it's called The Great Terror.
The Great Terror. Okay.
By Peter Lepkeman.
And Cindy's wondering, was there a deep anti-God sentiment that was part of what was happening?
That is more in the earlier 1930s.
Okay.
So we have targeting of ministers in the early 1930s. We have the shutting down of churches by 1935. And so that is really wrapped up in that period, although it does come up from time to time. So there's one file I looked at. The man had been a deacon in the church, and this was brought up in his arrest in 1937. So the church had already shut down, had already been closed, but this had been brought up later on. And interestingly, so this is why telling the Mennonite story is so fascinating, because sometimes we have memoir literature that we can then draw on as well.
Yeah.
So one of his relatives wrote about when he was arrested and how he had been at his daughter's wedding the night before, and they had sung a hymn, and then he was arrested. And so kind of, I know for sure in his NKVD file, it mentions his religious ties.
Right.
That doesn't happen all the time. That just happens from time to time.
Dorothy's wondering why some villages were left alone and others bombarded.
I don't know. I can't. I'm hoping to get some more information about this as we kind of dive into the files, but it isn't clear to me why there was this different treatment depending on village.
And is there anything, Tina's wondering, is there anything peculiar or noteworthy about the Mennonite stories compared to other groups like the Jews?
So Mennonites are going to get targeted also because they are there's a specific German operation that is targeting Germans in the Soviet Union. So that there isn't the same operation that is targeting Jews. So Jews are being taken up in different operations, not one specifically targeting them. So that's a little bit different in the experience. But everyone ends up at the same prison. Everyone ends up in the cell. Everyone ends up getting interrogated. Everyone ends up who won't sign being tortured or beaten or things like that. So and everyone ends up shot. So there are some commonalities I think that we sometimes try to overlook. We end up overlooking when we want to emphasize the Mennoniteness of this story.
Right. And John's wondering why did they keep such records on the prisoners and the people they were getting?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it goes to that they didn't think they were doing anything wrong. Oh. They were following procedure. And you can see this in the files, is that they are just ticking the boxes of what they need to do in order to pass the file on to get the result that they want. And so this is just them doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so there isn't any sort of shame in what they are doing. And that obviously makes us pause and think about this system where people can just make up lies and kill people, and it's just accepted as what you were supposed to do. And that comes up in going back to one of the other comments in the trials that the NKVD agents faced later. That comes up is that they were just kind of doing what was expected of them.
That's kind of chilling. Yeah, any of us could be there doing what we're supposed to without asking questions, right?
Well, and I'd add one more thing is very interesting. So some of the documents, the interrogation documents, are handwritten. Some are typed, and that would have been women. Typing up the interrogation documents. I mean, men didn't type in the Soviet Union during that time. So, yeah, there's this whole system, bureaucracy that supported all of this.
Have you come across Bill is wondering, have you come across any documents about prisoners being released?
Yes. Not necessarily in the documents, but in the memoir literature. There have been a number of cases in which people say that they had been arrested and there's information in what they give that can be confirmed, and then they were released. Now, whether they have a file is unclear. So the files we've been looking at are people who were rehabilitated. But if you weren't executed or sent to the gulag, you didn't need to be rehabilitated, right? So there could be a file for that person. It just doesn't fall into this category. And so, yeah. That's something that I'm going to look into once I can get to Kyiv.
And was there any negotiation required at all to get access to the files? Lynette is wondering, or you said the Ukrainians have been pretty open?
Ukrainians have become very open about these files, and they allow researchers to look at them, and I just had to ask for the files, and they gave them to me.
And is that only because you're a researcher? Could individuals go and ask as well?
I think anyone could go and ask as long as you can get an archival. You have to fill out the forms to go to the archives. But yeah, I don't think it's based off of being a researcher.
Okay. And someone's wondering, would there be any similar records in Belarus?
Yes, there would be similar records in Belarus.
Okay. And are those accessible as well, or is it similar to
No,
the Russian
no.
situation?
Yeah, no, Ukraine's the accessible one.
Okay. And John is wondering, what kind of analysis or synthesis have you done with your research thus far?
So, as you can probably tell by the types of cases that I presented on, I am following this story in Hortitsa and Zaporizhia, and I am trying to look at what was taking place there and focusing on files there to see if I can see any patterns emerging out of it. So that is kind of my focus, because at some point I would like to write a book about that, about Hortitsa. So that's what's happening so far. And I don't know if I can draw any conclusions, but I do, I alluded to it in the presentation, the gender aspect I think is very interesting, the different treatment of men and women, and then also the female story of this, which typically doesn't end in execution, but it still is a part of what took place and what happened.
Okay. Marjorie saying, my understanding is that our ancestry is not German, but Dutch, and learned German in Vistula Delta. Am I wrong in my understanding?
So by the time we like to claim Dutch when it's convenient for us. So we do that. We do that during World War I when the Tsar is trying to confiscate land from Germans. We claim, no, we are actually Dutch. And then under the Soviets, we try to claim that Mennonite is actually a nationality and that we should be considered Mennonites and not Germans. The Soviets didn't buy that. They said being Mennonite is a religion. And they categorized Mennonites as German. And so on everyone's passport in the Soviet Union, you were categorized, it said your nationality. That was part of their nationality policy. And so Mennonites were identified as German.
Okay.
Of course, we will claim to be Dutch again after World War II, but that's another story.
Gary's wondering, were the NKVD officials Ukrainian or Russian or both?
So the nationality of the officials is, you'd have to go into each individual one. So there would have been Ukrainians, there would have been, I believe there are some Germans in there, especially because in certain cases, so at least I had one case in the early 1930s in which the woman who was giving information, so she was being interrogated as a witness. She was giving her information in German. Oh. So she was being spoken to in German. So there had to be a native German speaker on the other side taking down her statement in some way. So there would have, we have to look into that as well. And then there were people of Russian, Ukrainian, and Jewish background, all were working in the NKVD.
That's kind of related here to the question that Edgar asked. Did some of the German Mennonites or did people in general turn their neighbors over to the NKVD to gain favors from the Soviet regime?
Yeah, so this is something that gets told in the memoir literature of informants who are within the villages, and you know who they are, and those are the people who are giving information and providing information to the Soviet authorities, to security agents, and yeah, so that is all part of the history that gets told in memoir literature. It's not in the files. There are people who are giving information. There are these witnesses, and so they're giving information. But that I think is a little bit different than the informants.
Right.
And so, digging deeper into the files, maybe I'll start to see those people as well.
Okay. Ben is wondering, have you come across files of Catholic Germans or Lutheran Germans?
So they would be in there as well. I don't see why they wouldn't be in there. People were targeted because they were, in part, because they were German under certain operations, and so they would have been a part of that story as well.
Okay. And Richard is wondering, did any Mennonites work for the NKVD?
I'm still looking. I would assume yes, would be my assumption, but I haven't found any cases to kind of back that up. I think I once saw a Sawatsky being named at some point. So, yeah, stay tuned for that one.
Okay. And someone was wondering what happened while in prison. Were there work crews when people finished their sentence? Do they have information about them returning to family or moving or getting into jobs?
So in prisons, I think, so initially you get arrested, you get sent to the local prison, you are processed there, and then you are sent to one of the labor camps if you're the lucky one. And then you work out there, and then you serve your sentence through doing a variety of work, and then you get released. And some people stay out there. Some people come back, depending on when they were released. We have a variety of stories.
Wow. I feel like I've learned even more about yet another interesting Mennonite story. So thank you so much, Aileen, and all the best in your further research. We look forward to that book when it comes out.